Hey y'all, this is Allison Henson. I am doing the facilitation for Creativity in Old Age, written by Smith and Vandermeer. They are coming from Lund University in Sweden. This article was written in 1990, so a little bit of history, what was going on in 1990. The president of the United States was George H.W. Bush. Nelson Mandela was released after 27 years in prison in South Africa that year. The Hubble Space Telescope was put into orbit. The Berlin Wall began to be torn down, and East and West Germany reunited. Operation Desert Shield was begun, and the U.S. went to Saudi Arabia. And The Simpsons and Seinfeld both debuted on TV in 1990. So, a little bit of background on the study. I have two really good quotes here to just kind of get us started. A person characterized by a generative view of life, so someone who's open to new experiences, is bound to approach the basic questions of health and illness differently from an uncreative person. Those who've had a meaningful creative life are bound to treat the events of illness, aging, and death with more tolerance and equanimity than those who find their life empty and meaningless. So basically, as one gets older, you're forced to come to terms with life and death, aging, illnesses, and their theory is that creative people have overcome obstacles in creative ways throughout their life, so they're going to be more likely to approach death with the same kind of creative ways to cope. So there were two groups that were tested. Group 1 was called the Selenium group. And that was because they were promised free selenium tablets for a year if they participated. Selenium helps protect against cancer, cognitive decline, and more, so that's pretty enticing for someone in older age. They were active people. They talked about how busy they were, youthful, healthy. There were 33 subjects in this group. 13 of them were men and 20 were women, and they were all between 70 and 72 years old. In group 2, they were from a pensioners association. They were more inclined than the other group to let their activities be guided by others and look for safety in the company of like-minded pensioners. There were 27 individuals, 8 men, 19 women, who were all between 67 and 86 years old. They were all considered to be middle-class people. They didn't really consider their education because when they were of the age to be going to school, it wasn't as common, especially for women, to get higher education. So some of the people who may have didn't, so they didn't really consider education. Between the two groups, the researchers believed that the population would be pretty evenly represented, and that was where they chose them. There were 3 percept genetic tests, which we're going to go into in more detail, and an interview that made up the test. Percept genetic is kind of just rebuilding and understanding the perceptions, and they actually figured out that the interview didn't really differentiate much between groups. It kind of just said that the people that they were testing were elderly people. So for the purpose of this summary, we're going to focus on the 3 tests. But quickly, the interview, the purpose was to kind of discover their attitudes towards ailments and causes of illness. So they had 3 big things: fear of illness, where subjects would rate their fear of illness on a scale of 1 to 14. And there were 14 total, 1 to 7 is what they would rate it on, and there were 14 total illnesses. So their scores could range from 14 to 8. And there was also life after death, which they answered the question by saying either there is no life after death, the possibility couldn't be ruled out, or there is life after death. And then they had 2 case descriptions where they talked about either Martha or Erna and kind of discussed their hypothetical situations and whether they thought that those illnesses and things that those people were going through were their fault or an outside's fault, and the answers they gave kind of helped them to understand these subjects better. There was one subject in the Pensioners Association group who refused to do this part of the interview, and they were actually the only one in that group that was scored with high creativity, so that's pretty interesting. So, the meta-contrast test, this tested how subjects could handle anxiety. So they showed the subject a repeated picture for longer amounts of time for each picture, starting with pictures that aren't that anxiety provoking. In the test, stimulus B was a person sitting at a table with a small window in the background, and stimulus A was a scary face that was shown in the window. And so they would show it to them further and further until they got the reaction from them. So they would show B for prolonged exposure times, and then when they reported B correctly, B was reduced to a standard value, and A got shown before B, but the time was constant for B, and A started at a short time and went higher and higher. And it stopped when A and B were correctly shown 3 times in a row. That picture up there is a tachistoscope, and that's kind of a machine that they were looking in to show them those pictures. There were different strategies that these people showed when they saw these pictures. They either showed repressive strategies, which they would like focus on other things, and that was found in a lot of creative people. Isolation or negative strategies, they were trying to separate the threat from the person sitting at the table. Sex strengthening signs were that they would say that the person at the table was wearing a tie or had a cigar in their hand. And transitional objects would be that they said that the person at the table was holding a doll or a teddy bear. The next test was the identification test, and this was made to discover how subjects viewed themselves, especially in relationship to their health. So they showed a really vague face to the subjects, and that allowed them to kind of use their self and how they see themselves to fill in the blanks of what was missing in the face. And they also showed subliminal messages that said either I well or I ill. And this was supposed to affect how they saw themselves, but also how they saw that face. The face was actually an actor in their mid-30s and 40s, but the man had feminine features. And this same face has been proven to look like a man or a woman, like a small child or adult or an elderly person, and can also show many different emotions. So they would show this picture, and the time got gradually longer with the messages that were being flashed before the face. And the subjects never noticed the messages, and if they did, then they wouldn't use those results as part of the study. The scoring was based on what the actor reported seeing in that picture, and there were a lot of different categories, like the gender that they saw, the age that they saw. They called it age regression, so if they saw somebody younger than themselves, and some other categories as well. And this study and the others have proven that this identification test is a valid test. So before we discuss creativity, we've talked about how creativity is hard to define. And this is how this article chooses to define creativity. So they said that it's an attitude towards living which may or may not be associated with artistic talent, scientific originality, or other typically creative endeavors. And in your discussion, I'd be really interested to see what you think about this discussion of creativity, especially based on the other things that we've been reading. So the next test was the creative functioning test. In this test, the goal was to understand the subject's creativity. The subjects were shown a normal, non-threatening picture, not exactly the picture I have here, but it was described as something similar, for shorter and shorter amounts of time, and the image was inverted to see if the subject can free themselves from the original picture and vision something else over time. So the subject saw the image with increasing amounts of time, and the increasing was over when they correctly identified the picture 3 times in a row, which was called the C phase, and then the picture was shown in decreasing amounts of time until they didn't see anything at all. They were scored with symbols, XX, X, X in parentheses, so on, and all those mean different things. The XX really just meant that it was somebody who saw that C theme disappear, but they made other creative interpretations of what those people saw, and the creativity kind of goes down from there. So the XX would be the most creative people, and the line would be the least creative. This test has also been validated among many different studies. So the reliability of the tests. All of the tests have yielded high inter-rater correlations in previous investigations. In the present study, the authors independently scored the protocols and there were only very minor differences between their scores. The procedure, which I thought was a little odd, the selenium group were given the MCT a year before the other tests, but the pensioners group got all of the tests on the same day. So, the interview results, if you'd like to pause the video here and kind of read some of these individual numbers, but basically the people in the selenium group, they were more creative, and 9 subjects in the selenium group reported that they had no fear of illness, and only 1 in the Pensioners Association did. They had a pretty even number, if you look at those numbers there, of people who have positive, negative, and mixed attitudes towards aging. As far as the results of the MCT go, the results of the group varied in regards to the isolation strategies, the stimulus distant transformations, and the compulsiveness. Okay, so basically that means that those who said that they had little or no fear were ones who had sex strengthening attributes or reported more transitional objects in the MCT, which is up there in table 2. And the group was pretty wide, but I'll go into more of which that group had which results in a moment. The IT results, the responses included comments about the face being young or active is what we are focusing on. So in the S group, a lot of people said that the face was young in the IWell series, and not as many in the PA group. These numbers are usually are actually attributed to the passive attitudes that the people in the PA group have. And active traits are more normally found in creative people. Creative subjects are also more likely to give the face emotions and not claim that the face is neutral. And they're also more likely to vary their responses. Uncreative people didn't vary the age range of the picture as much as creative people, and the PA group showed more reactions to the subliminal messages than others. So the subjects were grouped into 4 clusters after all of the testing was said and done, and it was based on 222 variables from the tests. And cluster 1 was the extremely creative group. Cluster 2 was a empathetic group. Cluster 3 was a more anxious group, and cluster 4 was actually the opposite of cluster 1, and they were the least creative group. The results were pretty much what the authors expected. The authors admitted that the selection of subjects may have been biased, that creativity from the creativity test was positively correlated with age regressions in the ILT. So those who were more creative were more likely to see a younger person in that test. Creative people are more likely to remember their childhood memories. Creative people are less likely to show isolation strategies, so they want to be with others. The identification test is a new test, and usually in that test they use I good or I bad instead of I well or I ill. Creative people tend to be more welcoming of aging and are more open to the idea of life after death, was the conclusion of this study. Older people, because of negative social stereotypes about aging, often become isolated from their own emotions and filled with doubts about themselves, all of this being detrimental to creative functioning. So we see amounts of creative people shrink during middle age, which may mean that these people are starting to lose that creativity in middle age, and we see it less and less as they grow older. Here are my references, and I look forward to seeing your discussion. Thanks, guys.